A masked man appears at a car window in total darkness, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. He tells the young couple inside he doesn't want to kill them. He just wants them to do exactly as he says. This really happened, over and over, in a small American town in 1946. And to this day, nobody knows for certain who he really was. Before we get into it, if unsolved mysteries and true crime cases like this one keep you hooked, smash that like button and hit subscribe. It really does help, more than you'd think. And there's a lot more where this came from. Now let's dive in. Throughout the year of 1946, the town of Texarkana became a brutal stage for numerous attacks against young couples in isolated areas of the region. The man responsible for those attacks was mysterious and elusive enough that he was quickly nicknamed the Phantom. The media at the time embraced the story to an almost absurd degree, and panic spread across all of Texas. In today's episode, we'll explore this dark chapter for the residents of Texarkana and discover how the Texarkana moonlight murders would become a morbid legend for the city. The history of the town of Texarkana is a curious one. It's actually a city split right down the middle. Half the population lives in Bowie County, Texas, while the other half lives in Miller County, Arkansas. You can even see this division in the name itself. Tex, referencing Texas, Ark, coming from Arkansas, and Anna, referencing Louisiana, which sits just to the south of Texarkana. However, according to one local legend, the town's name was actually inspired by a 19th century steamboat called the Texarkana, and there are also those who say the area got its name from a drink called Texarkana bitters. Either way, in today's case, we're diving back into the middle of 1946, almost a year after the end of World War II, a period when Southerners were searching for peace, but the emergence of a masked man would turn that search into a horror. The case begins on February 20, 1946, when a 25-year-old young man named Jimmy Hollis and his 19-year-old girlfriend Mary Jane Larry decided to go out with Jimmy's brother and his girlfriend. That night, the two couples had already gone out to dinner and watched a movie at the local theater. Around 11 o'clock at night, Jimmy's brother asked to be dropped off at home with his girlfriend. And for Jimmy and Mary, that was perfect, since it meant they could finally be alone as night fell. After dropping the brother off at home, the couple drove out to Richmond Road, an isolated area known as a meeting spot for young lovers. When they arrived and had been parked there a little while, around 11:45, a man appeared at the door on the driver's side, where Jimmy was sitting. The unknown man was carrying a flashlight with him, which made the scene somewhat disorienting. But both Jimmy and Mary could see that he was wearing a white cloth mask, similar to a pillowcase, with small holes, cut for the eyes. At first, it might have seemed like some tasteless prank, but the mysterious man soon ordered the couple out of the car, pointing a gun at them. Even so, the young couple still couldn't quite believe what was happening. The masked man approached Jimmy and said he didn't wish to kill him. He only asked that they follow his orders. The couple responded hesitantly, but ended up obeying the man. As they stepped out through the door, they noticed the unknown man was much taller than the two of them. The man's first order was for Jimmy to pull down his pants. The young man was outraged, but ended up lowering them. The masked man then struck Jimmy with the butt of his gun. Faced with that, Mary bent down and grabbed the car key from Jimmy's pants pocket, begging the attacker to leave them alone. But she too was struck in the face with the butt of the gun. Mary nearly fainted, but managed to regain consciousness just in time to hear the criminal demanding that she run. She took off running toward the woods, but the man shouted for her to come back onto the road. For some reason, Mary obeyed, but managed to run until she found a vehicle on the road. When she got close, though, she realized it was locked and there was no one inside. At that moment, she was caught by the criminal, who asked her why she had run. The girl simply said it was because he had told her to. But the masked man called her a liar and shoved her to the ground. The man then sexually assaulted Mary with his own firearm. While that was happening, Jimmy had slipped away and headed toward the center of town until he was spotted by a driver who helped him call the authorities. The sexual assault against Mary continued until a large amount of car traffic in the area caused the attacker to flee into the woods. Half an hour after that event, officers from Bowie County arrived at the scene, including Sheriff Bill Presley. At the crime scene, the sheriff, alongside 3 other officers, examined what had happened and the forensic details they were able to gather visually. A few tire tracks were found near the crime scene, but they didn't help identify whether or not they belonged to the criminal. Investigators initially deduced it was more likely he had arrived at the location in his own vehicle, and that he probably didn't live deep in the woods. It's worth remembering that the year was 1946, and that kind of violence wasn't normal for the region. In the end, the police force couldn't deduce anything beyond what they had already seen. Meanwhile, Mary recovered from her injuries in the hospital. At that time, sexual assaults were completely censored from public discussion, and although few people knew what had actually happened, Mary would take years to recover from the trauma of that attack. Given the characteristics of the attack, Sheriff Bill Presley gradually realized this was the first time he had dealt with a case like this. Bill was a World War I veteran, having served in France as a member of the American Expeditionary Forces. After returning from military service, he got a job as a public servant and later worked as a commissioner and treasurer for Bowie County. By 1946, Bill found himself as the sheriff of Texarkana, and the whole situation reminded him of the horrors he had witnessed during the First World War. At the hospital, the sheriff learned that Jimmy Hollis would remain in a coma for at least 2 weeks due to his injuries, and the only witness left would be Mary herself, who was completely shaken by the event. Still, she was strong enough to go back over the moment she was attacked by the man with the white sack over his head. And according to her, looking into the depths of the holes cut into the mask, Mary was able to confirm that her attacker was African American. Those were the only, and the first, pieces of information gathered about the suspect. The Texarkana police would work with them for 2 weeks, without success, and that would only change when Jimmy Hollis regained consciousness. Part 2. In his testimony, he described his attacker as actually being a white man, and based on the voice, Jimmy shared that it probably belonged to a man around 30 years old. But he also left the sheriff worried when he said he genuinely felt that the man's mind, in his presence, felt like a distorted mind. And when Mary's and Jimmy's statements were combined, investigators concluded that the only thing that matched was that the attacker was around 5'11" tall. However, the difference between the 2 testimonies led some officers to start believing that Jimmy and Mary actually knew the identity of the attacker. They theorized that the young couple was instinctively trying to protect themselves from a possible return, where the man would finish the job if they revealed his identity. For the time, that was an interesting idea, but the investigators of Texarkana had nothing more than a guess regarding those statements. In this way, the various interrogations over the following weeks became increasingly pointless, since no lead or new memory of that night was obtained. To make things worse, the trauma made it difficult for Jimmy to return to his old work routine as an insurance agent. Mary, meanwhile, found herself frustrated with the scar on her scalp, and the sexual assault remained a torment. As a result, she could barely sleep due to nightmares about the unknown attacker. It was then that she decided to move to the town of Hooks, Texas, where she was interviewed. There, Mary said she questioned why she hadn't been killed by the criminal, claiming that he had attacked again the following month. And indeed, in March 1946, a double murder of a young couple caused the residents of Texarkana to believe that the attack on Jimmy and Mary had only been the beginning. However, the authorities would remain hesitant to confirm that an unrestrained killer was on the loose. It was Sunday, March 24, 1946, and the attack on the young couple along Richmond Road was still the subject of many conversations and debates. But that morning, something would change when a local resident was driving down that same road where the attacks had happened. There, around 8:30 in the morning, he noticed an Oldsmobile parked alongside the road. That was somewhat unusual, so he decided to stop and check it out. As he approached, the sight wasn't good. Inside the vehicle, A man was crouched between the front seats, his head resting on his crossed arms. The unknown man's pants pockets were turned inside out, which made it seem like he could have been robbed. In the back seat, the body of a young woman could be seen lying face down, her pockets also turned out. Naturally, he believed they were unconscious, but he soon noticed a reddish, dried color near the seats. His next move was to call the police, who sealed off the area and identified the young victims. The man was identified through the vehicle, which was registered under the name of Richard Len Griffin, 29 years old. The young girl was identified as Polly Ann Moore, only 17 years old, identified by the class ring she wore on her finger, which had an inscription of her initials and graduation year. The young age of the murdered couple caught the attention of the police, who set about investigating both of their pasts. As far as was known, Richard had recently been discharged from the United States Navy and was living with his mother in a housing unit designated for returning veterans. He worked as a carpenter and painter and had recently started a romance with young Polly, 17 years old, a Texas native. After a few months of dating, on Saturday, March 23rd, the couple went to a cafe in Texarkana, where they were with a couple of friends, Richard's sister Eleanor and her boyfriend. At 10 o'clock at night, the couple said their goodbyes and headed to the well-known spot for Southern lovers along Richmond Road. The Cardew. Next day, their bodies were found, shot. Sheriff Bill Presley of Bowie County was once again one of the first to arrive at the scene. This time, the police chief of the city of Texarkana, Jack Runnels, was accompanying him, along with a few more members of the police force. They found a blood stain about 6 meters away, which indicated that the victims might have been killed outside the vehicle. Later, a pair of .32 caliber projectiles were found still at the scene, and officers confirmed they belonged to a Colt pistol. However, before they could investigate the area any further, a storm approached and swept away forever the few pieces of evidence left behind by the killer. As a result, Bowie County reached out to other agencies, the main ones being the Department of Public Safety and the FBI. 3 days after the crime, more than 60 people had been questioned. The attack had happened near the Dallas Club, and so several patrons and employees were named as suspects. Investigators believed the victims might have gone there and were later murdered upon returning to the vehicle. However, witnesses from the location didn't provide any truly significant information for the investigation, and eventually a reward of $500 was announced for any information that led to the arrest of the unknown criminal. The investigation dragged on for a few days until 3 different suspects were arrested, all of them found with blood-stained clothes and having difficulty explaining the blood. However, the number of potential suspects grew to more than 150, and of all of them, not one was charged. That double murder shook the population of Texarkana in different ways, and they soon connected it to the attack on Jimmy and Mary the previous month. As a result, young people were forbidden from leaving their homes, and curfews were set by parents. Some residents even began patrolling the areas around spots where lovers would meet. Part 3. And at the same time, all these worries were plaguing the region. There was a 15-year-old freshman named Betty Jo Booker, whose biggest concern was her grades at school. Betty was focused, and her looks caught the attention of the young boys, who received no encouragement from her in return. Her big goal was to become a medical technician. She was also passionate about music and was part of a few bands where she played saxophone. During that period of her life, she also seemed to want to find a romance of her own. The closest thing to that, really, was her friendship with her best friend, Paul Martin, 16 years old, who lived in the town of Kilgore, Texas. The two had met in kindergarten in Arkansas, and that friendship carried on into their teenage years, where they used to meet at church. So, in the second week of April 1946, Betty and Paul had plans to see each other. However, the diabolical hands of Texarkana's unknown killer would emerge from the shadows of night to sever the bonds of that friendship in the most brutal way possible. On the evening of Friday, April 12, 1946, Paul Martin said his final goodbye to his parents in the city of Kilgore, Texas. He said goodbye, letting them know he'd be taking a trip north to Texarkana. The plan was to spend the weekend with friends and come back Sunday morning. Upon arriving in Texarkana, Paul spent the day at a friend's house and made plans to see Betty on Saturday night. That night, Betty would be performing a show with a band called the Rhythm Ramblers at the Veterans Club. One detail worth noting is that, at the time, the band's leader, Jerry Atkins, had seen in young Betty a talent well beyond her years. So it was around 1:30 in the morning that Paul arrived to pick up Betty in his Ford Club coupe. But before heading back to the city with the girl, the two of them, for some reason, decided to go to the famous Lover's Lane, where they'd have a bit of privacy. That detail has led many to theorize that, even though they were close friends, Paul and Betty might have been cultivating something more. However, we'll never have an answer for that, because in the early hours of Sunday, Paul Martin's body was found by members of the Weaver family, who were passing through the area along North Road, near a wooded region. In a short time, they realized the boy had been shot. The police were quickly called, and Sheriff Bill Presley was one of the first to arrive at the scene, followed also by the Texas Police Chief, Jack Runnels, who joined the Seahawks' scene. Both noticed that the amount of blood in the area pointed to more than one victim. So, by the end of the morning, they had already discovered that Paul had gone out with Betty Jo Booker the night before. With that, a search was launched across the whole area, which soon became filled with officers walking through the bushes. Even some residents from nearby and from downtown Texarkana took part in the search. Eventually, Betty's body was found at 11:30 in the morning, nearly 3 kilometers away from Paul's body. She was lying face down, fully dressed, and her body seemed almost staged. The standout detail was that her right hand had been placed inside the pocket of her overcoat. In the end, it was concluded that the girl had also been shot. The weapon used was soon identified as a Colt .32 pistol. The autopsy analysis showed that Betty had been sexually assaulted, and the bullet marks on Paul showed that he had tried to flee from his attacker. Later, Paul's Ford Club coupe was found nearly 3 kilometers from the boy's body and almost 5 kilometers from Betty's. The keys were still in the ignition, and it remained uncertain which of the victims had been attacked first, though it was probably Paul himself. It seems Betty tried to flee, but was hunted down and killed. It was on April 16, 1946, that the two best friends were buried. When Betty's mother was interviewed, she said that if she could, she would kill her daughter's murderer with her own hands. Due to the public outcry, Texas's elite crime-fighting organization, that is, the Texas Rangers, found themselves obligated to intervene. For that, they sent Captain Manuel Gonzalez, who was seen as a regional legend. He had more than 25 years of experience as a ranger and was known by everyone as the Lone Wolf. According to the public, that man was the kind of officer capable of solving everything on his own. And notably, upon arriving, he quickly shared that he had been sent with the goal of investigating what appeared to be a series of violent attacks connected to one another. But it's worth noting there are many controversies about his involvement. It's said Manuel looked at the situation as something easy to solve. He was seen getting into his car and collecting information from various officers, only to later share it for free with the press, as if it were information he himself had discovered. Manuel acted like a showman, releasing confidential information purely for the love of the press. This caused outrage within the police force, who then started withholding information from the local residents and from the victims' families as well. That macabre story was becoming bigger than the Texarkana police force's own boots, and in the days that followed, investigators found themselves wondering what had happened to Betty's saxophone. Because of this, Police Chief Jack Runnels pursued the investigative angle of a possible robbery gone wrong, and this was reinforced when a man tried to sell a saxophone at a local music shop. The employees found that strange and called the manager, who questioned the man about the instrument's origin. In response, the man ended up fleeing, and the police were called. He was later arrested in a rented room, where police found a bag of blood-stained clothes, but no sign of the saxophone. According to the man, the clothes became blood-stained after he got into a bar fight. Along with him, a .45 caliber revolver was found. That man proved to be an interesting person of interest, but after intense interrogation, he ended up being released. Even though the instrument wasn't found, the police didn't believe it was the same item. So, on October 24th, at 46, the saxophone was finally found in some brush near the location where Betty had been found. According to sources, it had apparently been there the whole time, but nobody had noticed. Part 4. By the end of 1946, the reward of $500 had increased to $700. That increase in reward money brought in new, or rather countless, leads, but none of them led anywhere. Rumors and gossip took over the town of Texarkana, gradually turning the killer into a supernatural, powerful creature. At that time, the term serial killer still didn't exist, a fact that led the newspapers of the era to take advantage of the situation and act in a sensationalist way. The headlines said things like, "Phantom Killer Still at Large," in the days that followed, while the authorities tried to find the man behind. The press only cared about finding a nickname for the criminal. And to make things worse, the Phantom of Texarkana, as he would come to be known, would present himself as even bolder in his next act. May 3rd, 1946, was an exhausting day for the couple Virgil and Katie Starks of Texarkana. It was already around 9 o'clock at night when Virgil could finally turn on his radio and listen to his favorite weekly program. He was sitting in his chair in the living room, flipping through the May 1946 edition of the Texarkana Gazette, when Katie came over and gave him a good-night kiss before heading to the bedroom. She stayed in bed, having difficulty falling asleep, until she heard a piercing sound coming from his room. She shouted for Virgil to turn off the radio, probably thinking it was noise from the device. The man mumbled and agreed to turn it off. However, Katie could hear the moment Virgil got up from the armchair and, at the same time, heard a loud crash of breaking glass, and quickly got up and ran to the living room, where she found Virgil fallen over the armchair. Katie approached and discovered that he had been shot to death. She ran for the phone, but before she could dial the police's number, Katie failed to notice that, beyond the broken window, a mysterious man was lurking. At that instant, she was shot twice. One of the shots hit her left ear, and the other her lip. But what the killer didn't expect was that Katie would crawl to her room, where she remembered there was an old pistol hidden. That was the only way for Katie to protect herself from the unknown criminal. When she returned to the living room, the damage she had suffered was beginning to take its toll. Along with that, Katie could tell that the shooter, who was still outside, was trying to get into the house through the back door or window. And realizing the criminal was at the back of her house, she decided she should escape through the front. So Katie managed to get up and make her way to the hallway toward the front door, where she opened it and ran without stopping for even a single minute, going far beyond what she herself could bear in those conditions. Her first stop was at the house of her sister and neighbor. But to her despair, she wasn't home. Her last option was to run nearly 100 meters to the house of another neighbor. Luckily for her, Mr. Prater was home, and the first words he heard from Katie were that Virgil was dead. Given the woman's condition, he grabbed one of his rifles and fired into the air. For anyone who doesn't know, that's how the residents there used to send messages to one another. The neighbor, Elmer Taylor, answered the call and quickly arrived at Mr. Prater's house. As soon as Elmer arrived, Prater quickly told him to take Katie to the hospital. And there, the doctors performed emergency surgery with the aim of preventing the wound on her face from getting worse. The next morning, the Texarkana Gazette published a major headline reporting on the deadly attack on the Starks. The residence was taken over by several officers from Miller County and by the Arkansas State Police itself. At the scene, the first Arkansas officers were Charlie Boyd and Max Tackett, who were confronted with a brutal scene as they analyzed it. The sheriff of Miller County, Davis, walked through the door and everyone there realized this wasn't a simple killer. The sheriff's own response was to summon every officer from Texas and the Arkansas State Police so that a blockade could be set up along the nearest highways. His goal was to question anyone who tried to leave the area. The result of that was the detention of 12 suspects, of which only 3 were held for questioning. By the end of the day, the rest ended up being released. Investigators and officers examined the holes caused by the projectiles and concluded that the shooter had probably used an automatic rifle. The criminals seemed to have shot Virgil, and then patiently waited for Katie, which suggested he knew there were 2 people in the house. Naturally, at that point, every police department knew of the existence of the Phantom of Texarkana, and they quickly added another victim to the unknown killer's list. However, it was the first time an attack had happened inside a residence instead of on a deserted road. There was also a difference in the caliber used, which led police to believe there might be a copycat in the area. But that theory was mostly avoided by the police chiefs, who declared they believed in the presence of a single killer. Near the residence, a few tire tracks were found, but they couldn't be linked to any other suspect. Still, that same week, police dogs were brought to the scene, and it seems they were able to identify 2 different scents at the back of the house. But that evidence tends to be presented as questionable, suggesting there was possibly just one scent with different characteristics. The surrounding areas of Texarkana were on maximum alert, and that attack on the Starks left the local residents in a state of panic, fear, and fury. So much so that, at several points, the police themselves ended up being threatened by armed residents shouting for the killer's identification. All that panic led the police to focus their attention on areas near the crime scenes, while the residents of Texarkana patrolled vast, isolated areas alongside their weapons, everyone searching for something that might point toward the killer, but without success. It was then that, during that period, an unidentified officer gave his most sincere opinion on the case, describing the Phantom as a sexual pervert. That claim caused an uproar at the time. After all, that's a theory we apply easily nowadays. But it was completely unexpected for 1946. At the end of May that year, Texarkana investigators focused their attention on a curious flashlight that had been found near the window of the Starks' house. The flashlight had its ends painted red, which made it a unique model for the region. The officers didn't waste much time and sent the flashlight to the FBI's crime lab in Washington, where it was put under intense fingerprint analysis. When the FBI sent back the results, the local police were, at the very least, frustrated because no valid fingerprint was found, indicating the shooter had possibly worn gloves. As a result, the lead that was found was released to the press as a way of drawing public attention away from the story of a sexual criminal and from the local unrest. Part 5. In response, the city of Austin, Texas, sent additional resources for the investigations led by the Texas Rangers and the Arkansas State Police. Among the resources sent, what stood out was a mobile radio station and a teletype machine installed in the office of the Bowie County Sheriff. The teletype machine was an electromechanical typewriter with the purpose of sending and receiving mechanical, typed messages through a simple communication channel. This technology was innovative for the time, allowing direct contact between jurisdictions and departments across all of Texas. And the first major piece of information shared was about a red-haired suspect who had been seen armed and threatening residents in the Texarkana area. But that was dismissed, as it was concluded to be a random fight. Even so, for the officers involved, the speed with which that incident was investigated was reassuring. It apparently was a big step forward for the hunt for the Phantom of Texarkana. At the same time, rumors kept increasing throughout the city, with several residents becoming the target of senseless accusations. When those same residents were questioned and returned home, they had to work hard to keep their reputations intact. After all, for many, the criminal responsible for the crimes was a sexual maniac with a gun in hand. Faced with the collective hysteria, Sheriff Bill Presley had to appease each and every rumor and ask people to trust in the police's work. Texas Ranger Captain Manuel Gonzalez reinforced this by arguing that the rumors were making the investigations head in fanciful directions. According to Manuel, catching that criminal was so important that, unfortunately, investigators had to waste time on false rumors. After the rumors lost strength, local shops began selling new locks and latches, and gun stores saw countless local residents buying ammunition and personal defense and security items. The criminal's presence tormented even longtime neighbors who had to call ahead to let each other know they were coming to visit. The phantom was literally haunting the thoughts of the residents, who started calling the authorities at the slightest nighttime noise. The police, in response, announced that in the vast majority of these occurrences, there was no significant lead suggesting a burglar or criminal was lurking around residents' homes. That hysteria was reinforced by Captain Manuel Gonzalez, who advised people to keep their weapons ready and argued they should be used whenever they felt it necessary. As a result of the Rangers' position, authorities began receiving calls about gunshot noises, where local residents fired at anyone who approached their homes. Luckily, as far as is known, no deaths were recorded, but at least one person ended up being grazed by a bullet on one of those occasions. Over time, that hysteria became common in Texarkana, but strangely, on the killer's part, the authorities would be met with a disturbing silence, one that would give way to new directions for this story. Eventually, unpredictably, at least 9 local residents tried to convince the police force that they were responsible for the hideous crimes. However, the police were well prepared for those claims. Much of the information about the crimes hadn't been made public, and since the information didn't match up, the crazies were quickly dismissed. In Los Angeles, a man named Ralph Bellman confessed to the Texarkana crimes. Ralph had red hair and a long background as a former Army Air Force veteran. In his supposed confession, he said that several times he would wake up from what he called something bad, and after waking up, he'd discover the murders and feel deep down that he was responsible for them. Without a doubt, Ralph's profile was curious, and he even came to be considered a potential suspect. However, in his confession, he ended up several times sharing information the police already knew, and it was discovered that Ralph had been discharged from the Air Force for psychiatric issues. During that period, reports of young vigilantes camping out in isolated locations as a way of attracting the criminal took over the newspapers. That even generated conflict between the local authorities and the teenagers. Faced with the absence of new attacks, Captain Manuel Gonzalez ended up leaving the city in August 1946, 3 months after the murder of Virgil Starks. And in October of that year, additional investigators sent as reinforcement also left Texarkana. The withdrawal of forces was done gradually, as a way of not drawing the attention of the residents and the unknown criminal. Some of the FBI agents who were in Texarkana to assist with the investigations were also pulled by the agency. As a result, the investigation and hunt for the phantom ended up being left once again in the hands of local authorities. But the silence led investigators to be assigned to re-examine the case files countless times. The only facts they had in hand were that the first 2 victims, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jane Larry, described the attacker in a completely contradictory way to one another. Mary described him as a black man, and Jimmy described him as a white guy. Katie Starks hadn't seen the shooter and couldn't say whether the criminal was white, black, or even wearing a mask. The tire tracks were also just as useless as they'd imagined, and they couldn't even confirm whether they really belonged to the killer. Curiously, both female victims had been assaulted, and the attacks always happened over the weekend. Then there was also the type of ammunition used, which changed as the attacks occurred. The one major new observation during this period was that the attacks had all happened within a period of 3 weeks, meaning, to them, that pointed to some kind of pattern. Still, it was like reading some great ghost story full of death, madness, and the hunt for something the authorities of the time didn't understand the meaning of. After all, Today it's clearly seen that a refined serial killer was active in Texarkana in the year 1946. In just a few months, he proved successful in his trail of deaths. The Phantom, as he became known, disappeared at the same speed with which he had appeared, and that was unsettling for everyone involved. For the higher departments of the justice system of the United States of America, the same nation that had just won the war, it was now failing to catch a single man responsible for the death of Virgil Starks. The Texarkana Gazette newspaper, on its own initiative, called in psychologist Dr. Anthony LaPaglia of the Texarkana Federal Correctional Institute. The newspaper's goal was to understand the criminal's motivation and share his findings with the public. Dr. Anthony accepted the request and created a psychological profile of the Phantom. According to him, the criminal would continue attacking until he was caught. At the time, Anthony used the term calling card to refer to the criminal's modus operandi. Still, according to him, the Phantom felt enormous excitement in his random attacks. In other words, the criminal enjoyed applying chaos to a situation that should have been calm and pleasurable. Anthony firmly believed all the attacks were connected, even with the difference in setting and victims. To him, the killer displayed above-average intelligence and was probably following every detail of the case presented by the media and by the police themselves. According to Anthony, the Phantom was likely between 30 and 50 years old and lived a normal life like anyone else, but displayed a strong, sadistic sexual drive and probably wasn't an Army veteran. The doctor argued that if the criminal had served, his crimes would have a different character. Regarding his last attack at the Starks farm, Anthony said the Phantom was experimenting with a new type of target because he knew that the places where he usually acted would now be patrolled by police and local vigilante groups. In that sense, the Starks' 500-acre farm was more than perfect for his new way of operating. Either way, the psychologist made it clear that the Phantom needed to be stopped as soon as possible, because the chances of the attacks stopping on their own were minimal. And without a doubt, the Phantom of Texarkana was becoming increasingly adaptable in his way of killing. And this psychological perspective on the case gives us an opening to talk about a curious story that happened sometime before the FBI and the Texas Rangers withdrew from the investigations. In July 1946, while the investigations were still centered on progressing as quickly as possible, an officer of the Arkansas State Police walked a solitary path in his own investigation. His name was Max Tackett, 33 years old, who had been one of the first officers to arrive at the crime scene of Virgil Starks. That scene had marked Max's mind, and he was having difficulty letting go of the investigation. While analyzing all the case documents, Max noticed that on each of the nights the Phantom had attacked, a car was stolen in nearby areas. Notably, the car that was stolen on the night of March 24, 1946, when Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were murdered, ended up being found in a parking lot. However, it was never returned to its rightful owner. Instead, on June 28, 1946, the officer decided he would watch over the vehicle, hoping the suspect would come back for it. To his surprise, a person did come back to retrieve the vehicle, but what was surprising was that the suspect wasn't a man with an intimidating or frightening appearance. Quite the opposite, actually. It was a girl named Peg Stevens, 21 years old. At the time, Max didn't waste any time and quickly confronted the girl. Peg, however, replied that she had just come back from Louisiana, where she had recently gotten married to a man named Ewell Swinney, 29 years old. Initially, that story didn't convince the officer, but the girl soon ended up confessing that her husband was in the city of Atlanta, Texas, where he was trying to sell another stolen car. That new lead was promising for Max, who headed to the city of Atlanta, where he hunted down Ewell until he found him, and when the officer finally decided to confront him, Ewell fled through the area around the Arkansas bus station. The suspect tried to escape through the back of the building but ran into a dead end near the fire escape, where he was subdued by Officer Max. In the patrol car, The suspect seemed saddened by the possibility of getting the electric chair, as if he thought he was being arrested for violent crimes and not for car theft. And at that point in the investigations, UL came to be the main suspect in the Texarkana murders. The suspect's past was curious. For the most part, his previous convictions ranged between car theft, burglary, assault, and document forgery. The deeper they went, the more interesting UL seemed in the eyes of the police. When the officers told Peg that her husband was being detained under suspicion of being the Phantom, she seemed shocked, not by the news itself, but she said she was surprised at how the police had gotten to him. Under questioning, Peg said that one day UL had described the Phantom as someone with a brilliant mind. According to her memories, she said that a few months earlier, the couple had gone out for dinner and to watch a movie, and on the way back home, he had stopped along the road near Spring Lake Park to take a quick leak, but took a long time to come back. Curiously, that was the same place where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker had been on the night of the attack. Up to that point, Peg's words were like a relief for the officers. However, her statement seemed to change. Peg started, claiming she had acted as a spectator to the crimes, and said she had witnessed the murder of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. Later, she went as far as to say she had participated in the murders, and by that point, the police were already dealing with a flood of false killers giving false confessions. So the months went by, and those new discoveries weren't disclosed by the police, who progressed slowly while Peg and UL remained detained for vehicle theft. After all, that was the best lead they had. However, new confessions would come again only on November 20th, 1946, when Peg took the officers to the location where Paul Martin's vehicle had been found and said she had been in the woods nearby, watching the whole crime. The officers involved were surprised when they checked the case documents and discovered that a woman's heel had been found in that region. That information hadn't been disclosed by the police as a smart way of dealing with possible future suspects. In fact, the police force was holding on to several pieces of information at the time, including a diary that had been found in some bushes near the crime scene. And without a doubt, the investigators in charge of the case were even more surprised to hear Peg report that her husband's diary had been thrown into those same bushes. It was Bowie County Sheriff Bill Presley who had found the diary, and up to that point, he hadn't disclosed the finding to the other jurisdictions. Faced with these developments, the authorities once again came to believe that UL Swinney was the Phantom. However, his wife's confessions wouldn't be enough to incriminate him in that way, so deeper investigations were carried out. The officers managed to discover that UL had owned a Colt .32 automatic pistol, but that it had been sold before his arrest. UL's clothes were also all examined, and in one of his pockets, samples of slag were found, a byproduct used in the purification of metals. And curiously, it was discovered that Virgil Starks had a welding workshop on his farm. When the samples were compared, the result proved to be a match. Those recent findings, by the end of 1946, left the local Texarkana police more than proud of their work. However, UL Swinney found himself facing the situation he feared most, the death sentence. Faced with that, the suspect refused to confess to the murders and claimed innocence. The interrogations were intense, but UL was far from breaking under the pressure. Fingerprints would be the last way to connect him directly to the crimes, but unluckily for those involved, the tests showed nothing conclusive. Peg's confessions were the last new weapon against the suspect. However, holes began to appear in the girl's account, and her involvement started to be questioned. Over time, Peg came to be seen as an unreliable witness, and when a trial seemed possible, Peg appeared to take advantage of the police's setback and withdrew her confessions. To make matters worse, since the two were married, the woman couldn't be forced to testify against her husband. By that point, the entire case built against UL Swinney seemed to be falling apart more and more. The outcome was clear. They would need to drop all the murder charges against the main suspect. That defeat left the police frustrated, and they still made an effort to keep him locked up for as long as possible. The Texarkana police used extreme sentencing guidelines and presented the prosecution with the tactic of convincing them that he was a repeat offender, meaning he would commit his car theft crimes again and therefore needed to receive a harsher sentence. In the end, in 1947, the ominous criminal received a sentence of life in prison for consecutive car thefts, and that was a formidable outcome for the police. The great manhunt for the man, then known as the Moonlight Murderer of Texarkana, or the Phantom, had found the most likely suspect, but one who, unfortunately, was never actually linked to the crimes. To make everything even more dramatic, in January 1970, Ul Swinney appealed his life sentence and succeeded. In 1973, after 26 years in prison, he was released and found himself free to walk again. Curiously, although we haven't mentioned this here in this episode, the Phantom's crime stopped after his arrest, and the Texarkana police never forgot that fact. To them, Ul Swinney is the Phantom. This suspect, however, ended up dying. In the year 1994, abandoned in a nursing home in the Dallas, Texas area. But the story doesn't end there. There are still a few dark alleys left for us to explore together, ones that will take us into the troubled life of a teenager, and also up to Northern California in 1960. I'm talking about another serial killer who terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area under the alias Zodiac. And if you still don't know the infamous Zodiac case, I recommend you watch that episode as well. The months following Ul Swinney's arrest were marked by complete silence from the criminal. In the same way, it was clear to everyone that the investigations to find the Phantom hadn't been successful. However, in 1948, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders returned to the local headlines when a new suspect was identified by the police. Although the news caused a stir in the local community, the facts that followed were disturbing. According to the headlines, on November 5, 1948, the Arkansas police responded to a sad call involving a suicide. The victim was Henry Bucker Tennyson, 18 years old, a student at the University of Arkansas. In his college dorm room, Washington County Sheriff Bruce Kidder found a peculiar note. Written on it was a message in some sort of riddle that, curiously, seemed to be directed at local investigators. The note read something like this: "The opening to my box will be found in the following lines. In a paper tube it's found, rolled and cut, and dry and solid. The head is removed, the tail turns, and inside is the sheet you seek." Two B's mean a lot when they're together. These clues should lead you to it. The riddle referred to a pen that was inside the room, where, inside it, a note was found. The note contained the combination to a safe. Investigators believed it was the small safe located in the boy's own room. The pen was taken for analysis, and it was discovered that its tip contained mercury cyanide, which was later proven to be responsible for the suicide of Henry Bucker Tennyson. When the safe was opened, investigators found a series of handwritten letters. In one of them, Henry confessed his responsibility for the murders in Texarkana, and also made clear that it was those crimes that had led him to suicide. However, the investigators found themselves skeptical of those findings, because that would mean Henry would have been 15 or 16 years old during the attacks. The discovery seemed unlikely. It was too unusual for such a young criminal to be responsible for a series of attacks without raising any suspicion. And the investigators in charge of the case only discovered one thing that connected him to the crimes. Henry had played in the same high school band as Betty Jo Booker. However, they weren't friends and probably didn't even know each other personally, to the point of exchanging one or two words at most. In the safe, there were also more suicide notes that seemed to have been written in a rather depressive tone. In other notes, Henry blamed his suicide on his depression, but the supposed confession seemed to be just a way of continuing to be remembered, a way of justifying his act against himself. Henry was described as a boy with an overactive imagination, who seemed to enjoy taking credit for things that weren't possible. Investigators discovered that those fantasies seemed to fill other pillars of his young and brief life. This was reinforced by the testimony of the boy's own brothers, who told police that Henry liked to tell stories. His parents said Henry never had access to firearms, and fingerprints were collected from the boy and simply didn't match the prints recovered at the crime scenes. On top of that, James Freeman, a childhood friend of Henry's, went to the police and reported that he had been with him the night of Virgil Starks' murder. According to James, the two of them were at home playing cards and only found out about the crime by the end of that night. Some time, perhaps not so precious, was lost on this lead, but soon the suicide note was considered irrelevant to the main investigation. Those were dark times for the residents and the victims' families. After that tragic story, the Phantom would only return to the headlines in January 1949, when an unidentified black man was arrested on charges of a double murder. The Texarkana police wasted no time and quickly connected him to the Phantom's crimes. This suspect's name remains unknown, but he was 26 years old at the time of his arrest. According to sources, his arrest came as a result of a double murder of a black couple in the city of Waco, Texas, and the sexual violence he had inflicted on the female victim. Under questioning, he confessed to his crimes and claimed responsibility for the murder of Virgil Starks. The details given by the man convinced the police of his involvement in the crime, but soon that entire investigation fell apart again when the police discovered the suspect had worked for the Starks family. In a deeper investigation, it was discovered that he actually lived on the farm at the time of the crime, but nothing really linked him to the murders. In the end, no official charge was made, but the suspect ended up receiving a life sentence for the double murder he committed. The following years would be even quieter for investigators. However, somehow, they felt the case didn't want to stay shelved. It was as if the great Phantom haunted the minds of those tired officers, year after year. Proof of that came on July 9th, 1956, when local workers demolishing a school near Spring Lake Park, in the area where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker had been found dead in April 1946, found a bag containing red-stained clothes in the school's abandoned attic. 10 years had already passed since the Phantom's crimes. The clothing pieces were made of white linen, and the dark red stains caused quite a stir among the local workers, who decided to call the police to check out the item. The Texarkana police sent the bag to the state crime lab for a series of tests. The reports were clear. No blood sample was found on the clothes, which were actually just stained with paint. However, when the results came in, there was disappointment among those involved, who clearly believed the bag could be linked to the crime from 10 years earlier. The reports were clear. No blood sample was found on the clothes, which were actually just stained with paint. That incident ended up becoming an extension of the Phantom's urban legend, which by that point had already become part of Texarkana's history. Older residents said the killer had hidden in the school at the time of the crime, and that he had hidden his clothes in the attic there, ending up forgetting about them, only for them to be discovered one day. Of course, it was a big misunderstanding, but one that was welcomed with open arms by the local residents. Investigators went public to deny the rumors about the discovery, but residents didn't seem very inclined to believe that version. In the end, that was the last time the Phantom appeared in local headlines, and it was also the last time the files came close to being taken out of the drawer. Until the case was shelved, more than 350 suspects were arrested and questioned, but not one of them was ever charged with the Phantom of Texarkana's murders. And with that, our story leaves the lands of Texas to take us to the years 1968 and 1969, when the serial killer known as Zodiac loomed over the San Francisco Bay Area and its surroundings. Zodiac's reputation reminds us of the Phantom. His attacks happened in isolated areas, in some cases frequently visited by young lovers. One of Zodiac's survivors reported that he wore an outfit with a hood, which brings us to a macabre connection with the Phantom of Texarkana. There's also the similarity in his method of approach, done with a flashlight. However, the two criminals are separated by more than 20 years. Many aspiring investigative journalists tend to believe that perhaps Zodiac was inspired by the events of 1946 in Texarkana. But it's worth saying some of them also tend to believe the Phantom could have been 18 years old at the time of his crimes in Texarkana. and would have reached his 40s during the Zodiac attacks. Either way, what seems most likely is that there was indeed a great deal of inspiration on Zodiac's part. Perhaps in his youth, he heard about the Phantom of Texarkana and became obsessed with how his crimes turned him into an entity. But unfortunately, that kind of question will hardly ever have an answer. And just like Zodiac, the Phantom also got his own film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, known here in Brazil as Pânico ao Anoitecer. It's a film inspired by the events of Texarkana in 1946, directed by Charles Pierce. Curiously, Charles grew up in the region and was just a child when the Phantom was active, and his film ended up being shown annually after its 1976 release, becoming the main attraction at local film festivals. And every Halloween, the residents of Texarkana gather near Spring Lake Park, where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were killed. It's a peculiar, not particularly respectful way of remembering the events, but it was the way the residents of the region found to cope with that whole story. In our research, we found no evidence that this still happens today. The film's script was inspired by the investigations of Texas Ranger Captain Emmanuel Gonzalez, who by that time was already carving out a path in Hollywood after retiring in 1950. Even after retiring, Manuel remained with the Texas Rangers until 1950-something, later going on to act as a consultant and promoter for TV and film projects. The famous Lone Wolf walked some rather peculiar paths, so to speak, up to this day. Stories often say that Manuel ended up taking credit for several things he wasn't actually responsible for during the Auinas investigations in Texarkana. As for the surviving victims of those events, each dealt with it in their own way. Mary Jane Larry, as mentioned at the start of the video, had to fight to overcome the emotional trauma caused by the Phantom. And as far as sources say, she lived with nightmares until the end of her life. In the middle of all that, she and Jimmy separated years later. Mary had to fight cancer, a battle that ultimately defeated her in the year 1965, when she passed away at 38 years old. Jimmy Hollis, for his part, moved to Shreveport in Louisiana, where he got married and had 7 children. Some sources say he worked on some projects for NASA, but in 1974, he died of natural causes. The sole survivor, Katie Starks, recovered from the damage caused to her face, and after healing from the loss of Virgil Starks, met Forrest Sutton and ended up becoming Mrs. Katie Starks Sutton. Katie died on July 3, 1994, by which time all the old sheriffs and investigators of the Texarkana case had also already passed away. During the little time she lived as one of the last living links to the Phantom investigation, she was frequently visited by rookie officers who asked her about the events. Today, most of the original files and documents from the case have already disappeared. Modern journalists and investigators work with simple historical information to build their own investigations, or even to bring the case back to life, as is the case with James Presley, nephew of the former Bowie County Sheriff, Bill Presley, who had lived through the events of 1946. James wrote the book, The Phantom Killer, Unlocking the Mystery of the Texarkana Serial Murders, released in 2014. He worked for a long time as a reporter for the Texarkana Gazette, the very same newspaper responsible for sharing the case's information in the past. According to James, based on the documents he found, his only conclusion was that U.L. Swinney was the man behind the mask of the Phantom of Texarkana. Sometime later, the FBI also released on its website the digitized files of its investigation into the case, totaling 1,000 pages, where in one of them, it's possible to see the fingerprint collected at one of the crime scenes belonging to the alleged killer. And with that, we close the episode on another historic case, where a notorious serial killer successfully escaped the hands of justice.